Before we discuss the last creative manual mode settings, let's take a look at a few additional very useful exposure features of your camera. Even when using one of the digital vary program modes already discussed, you may find it useful to change the exposure up or down a bit. By using a plus exposure compensation, the subject will get a bit brighter. By using the minus, the subject will get a bit darker. To use the exposure compensation feature of your camera, press the exposure compensation button, move the main control dial to add or subtract exposure stops, now press the shutter button the rest of the way to take a picture. Another tip, reset the exposure compensation to 0 when you're done. Otherwise, it will remain in effect even if you've powered your camera off and back on again. A second useful exposure override mode is the exposure focus lock mode. This is useful when you want to point to and specify the part of your image that you want to be properly exposed and in focus, even when you later move your camera slightly to recompose your shot. To use the auto exposure focus lock feature of your camera, press the shutter button halfway down to activate the displays. Aim the camera so as to center in your viewfinder the portion of the image that you want to be properly exposed. Once the focus indicator glows green, press the auto exposure focus lock button. Recompose your picture by zooming out or moving the camera one direction or other. Now press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. Here's a tip. Keep the shutter button pressed halfway down in order to keep that exposure setting. Release the shutter button in order to release the exposure lock. The most manual creative zone setting is manual mode. Use this to set both the aperture and shutter speed setting yourself, and let the camera display an exposure scale, which indicates what your final exposure will be. This is very handy when you want complete control over your camera's exposure. To use this setting, set the mode dial to M. Turn the main control dial to select a shutter speed. Depress and hold the exposure compensation button while turning the main dial to select the desired aperture. You can view the meter through the viewfinder, where a 0 is properly exposed and a -1 or 1 is under or overexposed by 1 stop respectively. Then press the shutter to take the picture. A tip, if the exposure scale indicator is on -1 or 2, your exposure is 1 or 2 stops darker than expected proper exposure. If the exposure scale indicator shows a +1 or 2, your exposure is 1 or 2 stops lighter than expected proper exposure. You cannot use either exposure compensation or auto exposure lock when using the manual mode of your camera. Besides checking your LCD and actually viewing the image after it's taken, another great feature for checking exposure is by viewing the image's histogram graph. A histogram is a graph of all the highlights and shadows of your photo. It represents the range of brightness from shadows on the left to highlights on the right of a horizontal axis. Midtones are shown in the center. On the vertical axis, the magnitude from 0 to 255 of brightness is displayed. The higher the vertical line at any point along the horizontal axis, the greater the number of pixels that the image sensor captured in that range of shadows, midtone, or highlights. A histogram of a photo showing only a lot of pixels in the shadows range on the left side of the graph represents a picture that is mostly dark. And similarly, a histogram of a photo showing only a lot of pixels in the highlights range on the right side of the graph represents a picture that is mostly light. A well-exposed picture is typically one that has a fairly even distribution of pixels across the entire histogram. To see the histogram of an image, press the play button to review photos. Scroll to the photo whose histogram you want to see by pressing the left or right points on the multi-selector button. Then press the up or down points to scroll to the histogram of that image. Press the play or shutter button halfway down to return to normal play or camera mode.